And now we move on to our next panel, who's going to lead us on a discussion of what if people matter. And our moderator for this session is our host today, the director of Columbia's Center for International Earth Science Information Network, AGS counselor, and internationally known scientist, Dr. Robert Chen.
Thanks, John. So this is an interesting topic because it's a question, and I really didn't think about it too much in preparation for this, but I will say in the last 2 hours and in the last 2 weeks, I think there's some things to think about with respect to this. So in the last 2 hours, I've been thinking about the fact that there have been very specific people who have made a huge difference and who have mattered, both at a personal level, but also at, in terms of these larger issues. And so I'll add something that wasn't said in the formal recognition of the award winners at noon today. So first off, little fact, the reason I became a geographer was because of Bob Cates. I worked at the National Academy of Sciences. I had an earth science background, and Bob was chaired several committees, and I got to work with him, and so I had a master's at that point, and when I went to decide on where to get my PhD, I wanted something interdisciplinary. It was basically because I was exposed to geography through Bob that I picked a geography graduate program. And then when I finished my PhD at UNC Chapel Hill, Bob offered me a position at the Alan Shawn Feinstein World Hunger Program at Brown University. And I worked for Bob for about 6 years. So that was a great experience, and you saw a little bit of his interest. When I started at Brown, he had this idea of having hunger, and we worked on that for a long time. And then, of course, you heard him talk about making the world much more sustainable, or having as a target. And then, interestingly, when things were wrapping up at Brown, the opportunity to move to Season, which was a consortium, at that point a consortium in Michigan, came up, and I moved there in early 1993, the same month that Roberta became the president. So I worked for both Bob and I worked for Roberta, and she was, again, to emphasize, Season was not a geographic organization to begin with, but it was working at the human-environment intersection, and geography just fell out of that naturally. And the ability to think about population distribution, the first version of our population data set came because Waldo Tobler came to Season, and we worked with him to help develop the first gridded population data set. So Season was this opportunity to increase the effort and think in a very interdisciplinary way. And Roberta led that as president of the consortium. And then when the writing was on the wall, shall we say, the opportunity to move here to Columbia came up when the Earth Institute was being formed. And I will say, if Season weren't here at Columbia, there wouldn't have been many geographers for the AGS to talk to, and therefore there wouldn't be this collaboration or this meeting. So those little people connections make a difference. And actually there's one other totally off-the-wall connection, but Mr. Riley, who founded EPA, actually my brother-in-law worked with him in the formation of EPA, and my wife worked at the Conservation Foundation, which she just mentioned. I'd forgotten about that. And so there's actually a personal connection on my other side of the family. So more detail than you wanted to know. But that's the last 2 hours. The last 2 weeks is, of course, a case example where some political party forgot that people matter everywhere. And I don't want to get into the political discussion of all lives matter and so forth, but it's that understanding that no one wants to be forgotten, that everybody needs to be remembered, and that therefore, knowing where they are, knowing what they're faced with, knowing what their environment is, knowing things about them is just an essential part of success in this world. And I think, we at Season here and all of you recognize that, but making that better understood and making it possible for people to, make the choice to recognize that all people matter is really part of our role. And I just did throw this up here as background. I hope you noticed in your packet your little souvenir that has our global data set, very useful piece of swag, so don't recycle it along with the other paper when you're done. But also just the idea that there's huge amounts of opportunity. We just, for example, released some new data that we've developed in collaboration with Facebook, very high resolution population maps for selected countries, where, interestingly, the idea that Facebook came to us with, which comes out directly from Mark Zuckerberg's idea to extend internet to everyone, and to find out where people live in the rural areas. We do a lot of mapping and we tend to be biased towards the cities, but we didn't do a good job of figuring out where people are in rural areas and what's the best way to get internet to them. So those are real problems we can direct our effort to and do, hopefully useful things like generate data, but then also work with the community to make sure that we answer the question, what if people mattered, with yes, they do. I think, so now let me introduce the session, because I think our speakers are going to take it further. It's not just about where are the people, but what is it about them that we need to know? Are they vulnerable? Are they resilient to change? Are they able to utilize resources or not? And so I think we'll get into a deeper discussion of these issues. So we have two speakers on our panel. And of course, you've heard from one already, Gary Machlis. And so I won't reintroduce him, but we know he may have a tendency to want to throw out the script, maybe not. So he'll first give us his perspective. And our second speaker is Brent Mccusker, who's a associate professor of geography and chair of geography at West Virginia University. He has been a AAAS Science and Technology Fellow and continues to work with AID on various geographic analysis problems. He's worked on livelihood systems and land use in Southern Africa and over several decades, and has strong connections with universities in that region. So we'll have the two brief presentations and then some time for discussion. Gary, I think you're on first.
Thank you for your, what I understand to be temporary patience to hear from me again. These views represent myself, and I speak to you as a professor at Clemson University. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you and describe that is for me a realization, a personal awakening in the Buddhist sense, and a direct confrontation and challenge to the contemporary status quo of sustainability policy and practice. And with my co-author, it is also a nascent book. And the title is Desolation Row, Sustainability for the Oft Forgotten. And it begins with a story in a small paperback book that I found in a bookstore called Freedom to Starve. It was written by a Catholic priest, that's his pseudonym, in 1968, sent by the Pope from Nice, France, to northeast Brazil to minister to the poorest of the poor. He arrives passionate and ready to work, and he finds a critical question confronting him. How do you present the gospel to people who are so poor they eat dirt, who have no roofs? What do you do as a young priest when women come to you and ask you as prostitutes to pray for more customers so they can feed their families? What do you do about doctors who provide old, out-of-date medicine at high cost to the poorest of the poor, all marked not for resale? And what do you do when you go to the bishop and ask the bishop to sell the house that the bishop lives in to buy motorcycles for the priests to get to more villages in the countryside, and the bishop throws you out? It's an incredible book. And at one point, Gallet says, in a diary form, he says, I must stop now before my pen turns into a gun. And his book comes out of the liberation theology argument, the time in Latin America for the priority of the poor. So that book woke me up and had me ask a simple and deadly question. What of the oft forgotten in sustainability policy and practice? What do I mean by the oft forgotten? I mean the poorest of the poor, the underclass, victims of natural hazards, refugees, and the oppressed. And I want to emphasize, I am not talking just about the third world. The first world has its forgotten as well. Tonight in Los Angeles, over 50,000 people will sleep on the streets. And that is after a major effort to reduce homelessness. To do this, we have to kind of figure out what do we mean by sustainability. And you've seen these definitions, the triple E's of ecology, economy, environment, the triple bottom line, thrive and flourish, the natural step conditions and environmental discourse, or another one that says neo-sustainability. I go back, like Mr. Riley did, to our common future and the Brundtland definition, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. You've heard that, but what about the paragraph that follows from Brundtland? The paragraph that follows, where he says, in particular, the essential needs of the world's poor, to which overriding priority should be given. I find it intriguing that that is almost the same language as the meeting in Medellin and the later meeting of liberation theology in the church at Pueblo, New Mexico. Priority for the poor. And we take that definition, both paragraphs, not just the first, as critical. So a little bit about these classes of persons. The poorest, I'll go through each one. The poorest of the poor, there's all kinds of definitions. Living under severe overcrowding, non-existent housing, non-security, inadequate access to safe water. It's mostly people who earn under $1 a day. The estimate worldwide of the poorest of the poor is approximately 1 billion. Then there's the underclass, the definition of which can be based on persistence, generation after generation, priority, dysfunctional behavior, locations such as slums, imprisonment. The slums of Kinshasa, 2/3 of the population have less than the minimum daily requirement for nutrition. They're starving to death. And so the underclass has a population of approximately 510,200,000. Then there's victims of natural hazards, harmed, injured, killed. And as a result of both natural and sometimes technological disasters, and in the modern world, the link between the two makes it hard to separate. Often, for example, these victims are in the very slums of the underclass that I've talked about and linked to the poorest of the poor. But our best estimates would be for refugees that would be victims of natural disasters, about 22 to 27 million per year. Then there are indigenous persons, in both the first world and the second world. About 370 million indigenous persons around the world, often forgotten in sustainability. Then we have refugees, both Europeans headed south and Middle East headed north. The definition of refugee is slowly expanded from involuntary deployment from the state-sponsored war to include all kinds of internal and external refugees, including climate refugees. An estimate is about 73 million per year, and that includes environmental refugees, which will continue to rise due to climate change. Then, of course, there are the oppressed. Oppression is, of course, not just a state, but also a process. It can be severe deprivation. It can be discrimination. It can be exploitation, including human trafficking, slavery, and the child sex trade. It can be cultural degradation, and it can be politically motivated oppression by the state, ranging from arrest to torture and forced disappearance. The best estimate of the oppressed, I want to go back. Images sometimes help. These are Israeli soldiers and Palestinians, and these are Egyptian soldiers at a protest in Egypt. The best guess of oppressed is 2,467,000,000 around the world are not free in some measure. If you add all these numbers up, and you have to be very careful, the estimates are poor, and as I've suggested to you, they overlap significantly. An example being victims of natural disasters are often taken from the slums of the chronic underclass and the poorest of the poor. But by any measure, there is a significant population of invisibles. In China, there's a class of children called the black children. And they are children born during the one-child, one-family policy above that one-child level, where the families were so poor that they did not pay the fine and therefore did not register the children, therefore the children don't exist. Those children are now marrying, but they can't formally marry because they don't exist. They cannot join the Chinese army because they do not formally exist, and they cannot have children because they do not exist. Their children will not exist. They are forgotten. And believe it or not, in China now, there are about 120 black children. So, then, what can we do about sustainability for the forgotten? There are several proposals for policy and practice. Some are at the structural sense, and some must always be at the individual level. I just want to share a few with you. One, of course, would be to reform sustainability education. An unnamed Ivy League school that starts with a P and ends with a weight, like a ton, bragged that it had a class that did work in engineering, and the students were learning applied skills, and the students, as their class project, designed a better American barbecue. What a waste of talent. Sustainability education should focus on the oft forgotten and how to take those students and have their extraordinary skills apply to the projects of priority for the poor. We need to refocus our technical expertise. And there are several ways to do it. We could refocus our education at the institutions on disciplines and have disciplines like engineering understand what frugal engineering and life cycling mean for priority for the poor and the forgotten. Or we could do it by projects, by problems, and have interdisciplinary groups. We need to renegotiate the sustainability goals. Take a look at the Millennium Development Goals. Take a look at the new sustainability goals and search for the oft-forgotten. Search for the priority of the poor. The discussion of lowering inequality is not a discussion about alleviating suffering. For, of course, you can reduce inequality by simply increasing consumption. A bit ironic for sustainability, I would think. We need to revise the metrics of sustainability. The city of Vancouver prides itself on being a sustainable city. One of the ways it measures that is its ecological footprint. And using the most elaborate of ecological footprint approved methods, they came up with a number of the per capita impact of Vancouverites. Being somewhat skeptical and ornery, I had my students rerun the numbers and do a thought experiment. What would happen if you added 50,000 homeless to Vancouver? And you know what happens? They get more sustainable. They meet their 5-year target. Because, of course, the homeless don't use stuff, don't have cars, don't have homes, don't get to shower as much as all of us. A measure of sustainability that rewards a community for adding 50,000 homeless is a perverse metric, and we need to fix it. And we need to fix it and revise these metrics to consider sustainability. One brief example. This is not just the 100th anniversary of the national parks, it's the beginning of the 50th anniversary of riots in the United States, including the Watts riot. And the Black Panthers at that time put out a manifesto that got great press and great concern and response because the manifesto said, if you don't give us our demands, we'll kill cops. And that was terrifying. We forget what the manifesto's first requirement was: garbage collection. Because at the time, the ghetto of Watts, the city refused to pick up garbage, and hence vermin and disease. It may be the ratio of garbage pickup to garbage development, production, is a more fair metric of sustainability, and the community that picks up the garbage of the poor on time, as well as the rich, now that might be a sustainable community. And lastly, we need to reinforce self-organization. Gallet ends his book with the argument, I can't organize for them. They have to organize within themselves. And so when the technocratic expertise class, that's us, take the lead in sustainability policy and practice, we make it even harder, whether it's the people of Haiti, whether it's the people of Los Angeles, to achieve sustainability for the oft-forgotten. It's that self-organization. This is an image of women protesting rape policy in India. And this is an amazing man. He's the pen seller from Syria, a refugee, desperate to get a job, driven to sell pens because he was a single father and he had no place to put his daughter. A crowdsourced effort in the United States led to a small amount of money. He used the money to build a bakery in Jordan, and he employs 32 Syrian refugees like himself on his own. Self-organization. And this is an amazing young woman in counterpoint to building and wasting time on an American barbecue. This woman, a home economics class at Wayne State University, her class assignment was to do something useful for the oft-forgotten, and so she developed out of surplus auto industry materials a jacket for the homeless that can also operate as a sleeping bag and storage facility. The same expertise and skill set put to a purpose for the forgotten. That makes me hopeful. That's her, and of course she employs homeless in the making of the jackets. So I would urge you, go on to some electronic website and compete with me to buy copies of Freedom to Starve. I personally have run the price up from $3 to about $3.50. They're there. And then I urge each one of us in our own way to simply remember that the forgotten are still out there on Desolation Row. Thank you.
So how many of you knew who Billie Holiday was? Anybody knew who Billie Holiday was? I have her on my phone, and I was thinking that I'd start playing it to lift our spirits. It's hard to follow Dr. Machlis. It's hard to follow an election like the one we've had when this comes up. I got the title for the session sometime in early October, I guess. And it's What If People Mattered? And I've spent my career, whatever it is, working with people, and I thought, that's a really interesting question. And I knew the theme of the conference is sustainability. So what I teach my PhD students is, when you have to do one of these sort of presentations, you're not exactly sure where you're going to start. The coy thing to do is just turn the theme on itself. And so that's what I did, trying to be coy, and then, facts intervened in a very inconvenient way. So I titled this talk, Sustainability and the Perils of Forgetting That People Really Do Matter. And it's focused on livelihood vulnerability in Malawi. It is funded by USAID and NSF. It was nice being here while I can. So I thought, what do we do? What do we do about sustainability? What do we do about people? But I always teach in my seminars that we cannot ever take ourselves out of our actually existing historical context. We have to remember that. So what are the perils of forgetting that people actually really do matter? And I'm going to suggest that this is one of them. And I'm not going to suggest that in a political way. I live in West Virginia. I live in the middle of coal country. I live in the middle of people who have lost their jobs. I live in a state where meth addiction is out of control. I live in a state where people feel they don't matter, whether that we have actual facts and science to back that up or not doesn't matter. It doesn't affect their reality. And so because we have, and whoever that we is, and whether it's true or not, the idea that people have been forgotten can lead to really surprising outcomes and things that we never expected, we being whoever that we is. And I would submit to you that in my state where I live, scientists like us in this room are considered the elite. And they are considered to have forgotten people in my state who think that, they look down on us and we don't matter. And so this is a really fundamental question, and I didn't understand it, I have to be honest with you, when I first got this charge. And in the middle of me trying to figure this out, facts came in and said, this is what this means. This is why the question, what if people mattered, is so important. And this is another reason why the question, what if people mattered, is so important. This is a photograph I took barely 2 weeks ago. This is a photograph from the southern part of Malawi, along the slopes of Mount Zamba. And as you can see, and we've heard many times today, there is an issue about deforestation and conservation and sustainability. And what do those things mean? And I go up and down the slopes of Mount Zamba between the place I was staying and the local university as we were doing training in one of our programs called Youth Mappers, which tries to help university students understand geography and build maps for places that are blank or white spaces. And this is striking. I've lived in Malawi. I've been working in Malawi for over 15 years. And this is absolutely devastating clearance on the side of this mountain. Here's another photo, and here's how this wood comes down this mountain. It does not come in large trucks. It does not come through chainsaws. It comes down on headloads, on thousands and thousands and thousands of headloads, coming down the mountain relentlessly. Had I been able to go to Mount Mulanje, which is a larger mountain with more forest, I could have shown you the exact same photos. I've lived on the side of Mulanje. I've seen the same thing. This is what that slope looks like right now. If we take this and we look at what, that picture, and then I'm going to tell you that it's going to start raining really heavily in southern Malawi soon. The La Nina signal after a strong El Nino is usually massive flooding in this part of the world. It's going to rain on that slope soon, and that's just what I could get to get a photograph. This is another photograph of a different slope, and you can see this water is going to just simply come down through here, and it's going to wash away the road, and it's going to wash everything out. That's what the mountain looks like in 3 dimensions. I don't have the cool 3D fly-through. I'm a development geographer, not a GIS geographer, and those things take me more time than I have. But I wanted to give you at least an approximation of what this mountain looks like and the clearance that's going on around it. That's why. Oftentimes, when I'm in Malawi, I hear the problem is overpopulation, overpopulation, overpopulation. And it's a very compelling narrative because it's simple, and it's also wrong. It's not just overpopulation. We did historical studies using archives in Zomba Town from the colonial days, showing wave after wave of Mozambican migrants pouring into Malawi in the colonial period and the independence period. In the modern period, the current period, because the aid network infrastructure is so good in Malawi that Mozambicans come across the border, but because Malawi does not have a national identification card, there's no way to tell if someone's a Malawian or a Mozambican. And it's a big issue. It's a big problem. Malawi has 17 million people. Zimbabwe has 14 million. Malawi has more people than Zimbabwe. Many of you may not have known that. Many people don't know that because the population growth and the migration is high. What does that have to do with this electricity? Well, the story of deforestation is not a story of this simple equation of more people equals more pressure on natural resources. What's happened in Malawi in the last 2 years is that there has been an incredible drought that has affected food production, that has affected agriculture, that has affected every part of the natural environment. It affects the amount of water in the Shiri River, which happens to power the big hydroelectric dam on the Shiri. And so people in the towns like Zomba and Blantyre and Lilongwe and Dedza and Nsanje and all of the other places in Malawi need to cook food. So the people in the cities have the purchasing power to buy charcoal from their rural brethren who are very, very poor. And so those people head down that mountain multiple times a day, 24 hours a day with those headloads because electricity is off. Why is electricity off? Electricity is off because there's a lack of investment in the grid from the national government. The national government has not paid attention to this. There's donor fatigue, I'm told, in Malawi because of the donors trying and trying and trying to get this together. And so the simple sustainability narrative is not around simple population growth. We have a very complex situation that we have to untangle. And so it's with that approach that I have looked at sustainability in Malawi, or I have tried to look at sustainability in Malawi and other southern African countries, not through a simple narrative that's easy to tell. We have to keep our complexity. We can't simplify things to the point that they don't make sense. So what we have tried to do is take a very complex situation, analyze it as best as we could, and then turn that narrative and really challenge ourselves to make that understandable without making it simplistic. So we look at this. This on the left is a map of recent shocks that I'll get into just a little bit more detail, but the darker purple areas are households that experienced six or more individual shocks to their household livelihood system, major disruptions in 1 year. If we look at population projection, this conference is focused on 2050. Right now, Malawi has 17 million people. Ceteris paribus, in 2050, it will have 40 million people. 40 million people. Some of our best scenarios with all of the error that goes around that of climate, temperature and precipitation do not support this sort of scenario in the 2050 period. That's a map we produced. Some colleagues of mine from University of Texas at Austin produced this to show us some rainfall potential scenarios for southern and northern Malawi. all of the people in Malawi live in the south. That's the population density. So we're taking rainfall away while we're raising temperature and the number of people. So this is the challenge, and it's an interconnected challenge. So we were asked by USAID, I did work for USAID as a AAAS fellow in 2011 and 2012, where we explored these sort of possibilities, and we were asked by them to explore livelihood vulnerability, which is a bit different from climate change vulnerability. I won't get into it because it's technical and a bit convoluted, but we were asked to help USAID in various countries to understand the dimensions of livelihood vulnerability for these oft-forgotten people. And these are the most vulnerable people in the world, I would argue, some of the most vulnerable people. So we took household-scale data sets. We analyzed and mapped the livelihood systems. We analyzed the shocks to those livelihood systems. And we determined the household characteristics that correlate to each type of shock. So right up front, I learned working for aid, the headline findings go up front or the administrator pulls out the iPhone. Malawi is the most vulnerable country that we've analyzed. We've worked in Ethiopia. We showed that Feed the Future programming in Ethiopia worked, which has shocked people that a government program worked. We did that statistically. We were able to show success. We worked in Uganda, Rwanda, Niger, and Bangladesh. And of those countries, Malawi is off the charts in terms of the level of vulnerability to coupled, what we have often called coupled economic and climate change. But here's the thing that was a bit surprising when we first presented these findings to the mission, the USAID office in Lilongwe. Everyone likes to say that, the big flag event is the drought or the flood. It's what brings our attention to the disaster. And what we found over and over and over again is while those are important issues, that there are often underlying shocks that make people vulnerable that go unreported or underreported because we're not asking the questions. And so in Malawi, in 2013 and 14, food price shocks were actually much more of a problem than drought and natural hazards, even though they were present, drought and natural hazards. And we know that in the developing world, what will get people to the streets quickly are unsustainable prices for food. We know that, and so I'll show you that in just a second. And agriculture and hazard shocks were also widespread in that year. However, they weren't that as dominant as food price shocks. We didn't want to just say, here's where vulnerable people live. That's not really helpful, is it, at the end of the day? Yes, we know where the clusters of vulnerable, and that vulnerable doesn't equal poor, by the way. It's not income. It's the likelihood of the livelihood to be shocked by some sort of either internal to the household or external to the household event. And what's a little different is we get in some of the events that you never hear about, and I'll get to that in a second, but it's only a limited help for us. And so what we wanted to do is build profiles of the households and say, what is it about the households that makes them more or less likely to experience these shocks? And across Malawi, all the various shocks and across the geography, we found that education, gender, access to land, livestock holdings, and distance to the road network matter as to whether or not a household is vulnerable. And it's not always the direction that you think. Oftentimes, female-headed households are less vulnerable. It depends on what we're looking at. So let's look at it. This data set is a large-scale data set of 12,000 households. We then use panel data so that we're looking at 2010 and 11 and 2013 and 14 so that we can better analyze these households, that we're not taking a snapshot approach. We then map where the households with the distribution of vulnerability live. And so in darker colors, darker reds, we get clusters of larger, more widespread vulnerable households. And so if we look at Malawi in the south, we see a great deal of vulnerability. We see in this area around one of those mountains that I talked about being deforested, we have high levels of vulnerability. And we're able to say what matters most when we look at these different dimensions that I'm going to show you in just a second. Again, these are what matter because this is what USAID can program to. They can't program to where are poor people. They can program to if a woman in Ethiopia has a tertiary education, she is 6 times less likely to have a food price shock. Those are some of the headline findings that we've produced. If we have female-headed households in Uganda, they are less likely to have a health shock. And we're able to explore some of the why after that when we're asked for follow-up. So that's the total picture. That's the distribution of shocks, and it broke our scale. No country had ever had this many people experiencing this many shocks in a one-year period of time. So we had to create an entirely new graphical scale for Malawi because the vulnerability is so high. On the left are the food price shocks I mentioned, and you can see they're incredibly high throughout the country of Malawi. Only about 50% of households are able to meet their annual food consumption needs in any way with their own production. So most households, in fact, are buying at least some, if not half, of their annual food needs. So they're very dependent on agricultural markets. If those markets aren't functioning properly, or if there's a problem in terms of distribution, you'll see it in the food prices, and we certainly did. How does that relate to the other shocks that households face? Because it's not just one thing that we're looking at. And that's really our story. It's our question. How do these interact? What are we missing if we only focus on the environment as the main discussion of sustainability? And this links back to those deforestation slides that I'll get to in just a second. Natural hazards are prominent, and they are a problem, and you see the distribution on the right of the areas with higher natural hazard shocks, meaning drought, flood, landslide, and fire. And importantly, within that slide, I zoom in here, we can figure out what those issues are. So for instance, looking at natural hazard shocks, literacy of the household head matters. Where does it matter? This is what in the federal government previously we called focus and selectivity. We can't address every challenge, but we have to be focused, we have to be selective, we have to use data. And this is data generated under Administrator Shaw of USAID, who was committed to using the best science possible to address these questions. And I have the methods at the end if you're interested. For these maps to get up here, we run them through 3 different regression analyses to make sure that we're absolutely sure that we're as confident about these as we can be. And if we're not, I'll show you what we do to communicate that. So we know where that factor matters. Health matters. We rarely get to see, on the right, a map of health shocks because we don't think we have the data for it, but we do in some places have the data. So if a household is experiencing a health shock, they're much more vulnerable to any other covariate shock that comes along. And we're able to communicate these complex topics. This was our biggest challenge. I remember Tiffany Holland is over there sitting on the side. She helped us with this. She's now at Esri. She helped us at USAID to figure out how do we communicate this to policymakers, to decision makers. And we sat in the hallway at USAID with a piece of paper and tried to figure out how do we make this, who wants to explain a regression analysis? Anybody? Who wants to explain geographically weighted regressions? Who? Somebody want to get up? I'll stop. If you can go up here in 5 minutes and explain a geographically weighted regression. I can barely do it, and I use the stuff. And so we were trying to figure this out, and we went through iteration after iteration after iteration, and somebody in the middle of the room earlier in the day said, how do we talk about uncertainty? We put a standard error map on our first poster product. It's the little gray map right here, the little gray map. And it said, in our legend, being the scientists that we were, and she's laughing because we were just so sciencey, standard error. And our director, who's smarter than all of us, said, if you put that on a map, people are going to ask you, do you mean this is wrong? And so we changed the word. We call it confidence level, how confident we are in the map. And that's what we did. Is it right? Is it wrong? No, but the people who have asked us about it understand what we're trying to communicate better or not. So I wanted to point that out because that's a fantastic question, how we communicate. We spend more of our time in these maps figuring out how to communicate to people than we actually doing the geographically weighted regressions and the spatial filter models and the Lisa cluster analysis and all that stuff that nobody's going to want to hear about. But we can then get to a series where we understand where are those oft forgotten people, where are the vulnerable, where are they, and how do we start to understand that in a programming sense to address those issues. So just to conclude, trends in Malawi are not reassuring. They're not. When we forget that people in these places have these problems or we don't know about them in the first place, I link right back to the deforestation. It's not a simple function of population and resource greed. It's a function of people who feel very much, and I've sat with many people in Malawi talking about this, that no one thinks they matter. So without this inclusivity and without actually listening to people, that's the best thing we can do is listen, wildly unexpected results can occur. Such unpredictability, I would argue, can upend years and years and years of our best attempts to make the planet more sustainable. So if there's one message I'll leave you with, it's let's listen more. Thanks.
So those categories that were put up earlier of the kinds of people, that was in yours, right, Gary? Has anyone mapped that?
No.
Okay. That would be a cool map.
Yes.
And then it would be cool to see it mapped, and it would be cool to see the projections, because some of those are
That data is
upward. Some of those categories are getting bigger with the growth in world population. Some are getting smaller because of progress, and they're definitely distributed spatially in perhaps non-obvious ways.
The data are available. They can be disaggregated at the level of global regions and continents, but when you get to nation states, there's so much false data presented on things like the imprisoned or the sex trade, child sex trade, that the numbers start to become extraordinarily difficult. Try getting, for example, in terms of oft forgotten, the data on the number of women with with mutilation, genital mutilation in India. It's almost impossible to actually get accurate numbers. So you can bracket them at the regional level, but we're not yet at the point of dealing with it at the national level, or much less even tighter. And the double counting issue is extraordinarily difficult because by nature, those classes are forgotten. Remember, if you're poor and black and a woman and disabled, all four of those categories can have a significant impact on your status. And so the overlapping problem has been yet to be worked out.
Let me just say that under the Sustainable Development Agenda, there are a bunch of groups that are trying to map exactly those categories. One of the mantras or mottos of the agenda is leaving no one behind, and there is a whole set of categories, including the disabled and displaced and others, where people are trying, but with exactly those limitations that you mentioned. So is there another question or comment? Here in the table, okay.
Dr. Machlis, my name is Ann Knipe. I am one of the AP Human Geography teachers here with the Teacher Fellow Program. And from a teacher perspective, I would like to know, is there any way that I could gain access to your presentation this morning for a minimal fee of maybe $2.50 or $2?
Bring me your card. We'll find a way to give it to you. The book will come out in 2018.
Yes, sir.
It does not pay any royalties. There's no way you can ethically earn money on the back of the oft forgotten. And so that would be one way, because in a very real sense, it's the young people that you're responsible for that can be awakened to this. And I'll trade you. The fee would be encouraging your fine students to wake up.
Thank you so much.
Okay.